Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
And this marker, we hope, will support the legacy of the Women's Improvement Association. So let's take a look at it. Let's see what's behind this blanket.
The League of Women Voters of Southern New Mexico marking the installation of a national Votes for Women trail marker at Pioneer Women's Park in Las Cruces. The marker is part of the National Women's Suffrage Trail. The League got permission from the Las Cruces City Council to install that marker. The effort also supports the legacy of the Las Cruces Women's Improvement Association. Thank you so much for joining us on this special edition of Newsmakers. I'm Fred Martino, and joining me to talk about this effort and the current threat to voting rights, Eileen VanWie is the co-president of the League of Women Voters of Southern New Mexico, and Rebecca Courtney of the Progress Club of Las Cruces. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. And Eileen, I want to start with you with some basics to tell us about how this project to have a Votes for Women marker at Pioneer Women's Park, how it came about.
Thank you, Fred, for having us today. Back in February of 2019, members of the State League of Women Voters were approached by a representative of the William Pomeroy Foundation, which is a New York-based foundation that supports the preservation of local community history. And for the celebration of the centennial of the 19th Amendment, they were inviting states to apply for markers that would identify suffrage work that had gone on in their states. So they were looking for sites in New Mexico. And with a little bit of research, we realized that it was the Women's Improvement Association, which was one of the General Federation of Women's Clubs, were the suffrage rights workers for voting rights as well as women's rights in Southern New Mexico. And so we joined with the Progress Club because they are also a General Federation of Women's Club to do some more research. And part of the application was getting onto the National Votes for Women Trail, as you mentioned. And if you Google that, you will be able to find that there are over 2,020 sites around the country on that. They wanted 2,020 for the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which they received. And it was a lengthy process to apply, but we were very pleased that we were accepted. And so now we have the marker at Pioneer Women's Park.
So wonderful to see that. And Rebecca, time for some history now. Tell us how the Women's Improvement Association was formed and then why it was disbanded.
Yes, it is a wonderful story. It goes back to 1894. And there were 5 women in Las Cruces area who were taking their dear friend to be buried. And they had to make arrangements to carry their friend in the back of a coal wagon. And they were very distressed by that. You know, they knew in their hearts that there weren't enough services in this community for people. And so they vowed to form a group of women that would start bringing services to the Las Cruces area. And of course, one of their first goals would have been to buy a nice hearse. And so they did form this group, Women's Improvement Association. And but they were not just wanting a hearse. It went well beyond that. They wanted public buildings and parks and libraries and clean water and healthcare and more for this community. And so they started with 15 original members, and they were so determined and proud of what their goals were that they even sold stock in the WIA as part of their fundraisers. And they were serious. If a woman missed a meeting, she was charged 25 cents. So, you know, they had to come to these meetings and do their part. And, you know, they lasted a long time. You ask what caused them to be disbanded. they lasted over 10 decades. And they provided so many services to this community that when they did disband in the year 2000, they had to sell their WIA building, which was their clubhouse built in 1927. It's on Raymond Street across from the park. And they sold it to the city for $1. And the city still uses it. That's what I like. It's amazing. But they actually, in those 10 decades, they never stopped providing services to the community. They worked through World War I and II. They were in the Great Depression. They served people with health care and education. And they worked with the city and the state to provide services actually that the citizens get now from communities like a city or a state or the federal government. But I think they began to disband or slow down it really in the 80s and 90s because women were more in the workforce. The WIA, those women thought that education was one of the goals that women were lacking. And nowadays, women are going to college, they're professionals, they're out in the workforce in large numbers, maybe 50% of the workforce in many places. And so those women are busy. But there's women taking care of families and doing other things. And so I think gradually the WIA, I don't even want to say aged out. They just decided that they had accomplished their goals. And I think, in my opinion, they retired with grace.
Okay, and we will have more on that history coming up later in the program. Eileen, give us a sense of what association members did to support women's suffrage.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the General Federation of Women's Clubs were very active in women's suffrage for getting voting rights, and they had a legal framework and agendas that focused on that for a long time. They had these legislative committees that would focus on advocating for women's rights through the state legislature. And the WIA was one of the groups that helped to get the right for women to vote in school elections in the New Mexico Constitution during the statehood process of 1912. But the compromise was pretty tenuous because if enough men objected at the county or city level to women voting, that voting right could be taken away. And so we, Rebecca and others of us, went to the archives at New Mexico State University, and we read some of the minutes of the Women's Improvement Association. And we found that on December 1st of 1917, the members passed a motion to send a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson for passage of the suffrage amendment. And they authorized who was their secretary at the time, Laura Frenger. She was a very active voting rights activist. She was authorized to send the telegram. So then the minutes for January 5th of 1918 show that the association paid 80 cents to send the telegram.
Very interesting. Another part of this history that we're exploring today is Pioneer Women's Park. Rebecca, tell us how the park was created and how it helped city residents.
They really wanted a park. And I think that's actually their first large civic project versus the hearse. They purchased the land where Pioneer Women's Park is now, there at Las Cruces and Raymond Streets. They raised the money to purchase that land. They put in irrigation, all the plantings, and of course they built the gazebo, which had what we call wings on either side back then. And they wanted to name this park Union Park because they wanted the entire population of this city to come to this park and relax and enjoy it. And in fact, they dedicated the park in 1898, 4th of July, 1898, invited the entire city to come. They had a concert in the gazebo or bandbox, however you want to call it. And they had ice cream and they had speakers. And they made sure that everything was presented to those who attended in English and Spanish so that everybody could understand why this park was built and that it was for everybody to enjoy. And of course, this was the first of many civic projects that they completed, but one of those wings was actually where they met. The WIA met there, and they did their suffrage meetings there and plannings, and they turned that one wing into a lending library. It was technically the first library. They had gone over to New Mexico A&M at the time and checked out their library, and it was full of technical books, and that was not the point. So the dearth of books in this city was a problem for them, and they wanted novels and great literature to come to Las Cruces, and so they established a lending library there. And later, of course, when they built their clubhouse in 1927, that turned into the first city library of sorts, only it wasn't free. They charged families $1 a year to check books out. And
Very
that money, of
interesting.
course, yeah, so they went to buy more books, right?
Yeah, lots of contributions beyond the park and beyond their advocacy for women's suffrage. And I want to move to women's suffrage. Voter suppression is still an issue today, and we're going to get to that in a moment. But Eileen, I want to start with that significance of the 19th Amendment, and if you can talk about that briefly.
Okay, I might have to cut out some of the things I had prepared, but the answers to that question kind of depend upon who's telling the story. And with the centennial of the 19th Amendment, more and more people are writing about it. But here's what my understanding of the situation is. It goes back to the struggles that women faced as far as their rights and voting. And voter suppression really existed in the United States since the Declaration of Independence from Great Britain in 1776, where Abigail Adams wrote a letter to her husband asking him, when they were working on in the Continental Congress, urging him to remember the ladies. Well, of course they did not. And it was decided then that white men who owned property would be the voters in the new country. And in the 1830s, white women were noticing that the Haudenosaunee Iroquois Indians had equal roles for men and women. And so they could see that women could have these handle these rights to vote. And they were also told not to speak out. And yet they began to speak out against slavery and for gender equality. So all along, voter suppression has been to suppress the rights of Black and brown people. And with the anti-slavery movement, the women were gaining more confidence to do that. And until the Civil War then, women and men of various ethnic backgrounds worked together to oppose slavery and to work for suffrage for women. And so during the war, the struggle for women's rights was set aside to focus on the abolition of slavery. And of course, with the end of the Civil War, Congress was able to pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which abolished slavery and gave citizenship and voting rights to Black men. So some of these amendments made some of the white suffragists angry. Like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony at that point began to say that voters should pass an educational test before they could vote. While some of the other suffragists like Lucretia Mott and Lucy Stone, they supported the 15th Amendment and universal suffrage. But voter suppression in some states got really out of control. They created voter qualifications, instituted poll taxes and literacy tests to prevent Black people from voting. And the white supremacist group, the Ku Klux Klan, attacked Republicans and organized lynch mobs to suppress Black emancipation. So with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, it was intended to be for all women, but just as suppression was rampant after the 15th Amendment was passed and regarding to Black men voting, voter suppression now focused on Black and brown women. And there was an example of the National Women's Party and the League of Women Voters at that time really did not support, there were a lot of African-American women votes and people Black women who wanted help being able to vote. And I think there's an example that was read from a primary source of information from the National Votes for Women. If I can just give you this one example of an African-American woman who wrote a detailed and informed letter in October of 1920 describing how she and other Black voters were unable to suit the registrar of North Carolina. And the National Women's Party responded by saying there wasn't a way to help them at that moment, but that the party would press for Congress to create an enabling act that would give the federal authority over registration and election laws in the coming spring.
And Eileen, I'm going to run out of time, so I want to emphasize that this, unfortunately, is not simply in our history. If you look at the 2020 election, many people may be thinking about this right now, I certainly am, that we saw stunning stories on television where in certain states, such as Georgia, people were waiting in line for hours and hours to vote, often in minority communities, because there was simply not the infrastructure in place to support the vote adequately so people would not have to wait as long as they did. That is just one example. And of course, right now, all over the country, there are efforts that some people are calling voter suppression. If you can talk about that. Yes,
I'm gaining quite a bit of information from the Brennan Center for Justice on this, but on March 12th, they reported that there are over 250 bills that have been proposed in 43 states, which would restrict access to the ballot. And some of these proposals take away vote by mail options, they tighten identification requirements, they rig the redistricting process, they slash voter registration opportunities, they purge voter rolls, and the most serious is their attempt to suppress democracy. The two states to the east and west of us are some of the worst offenders. Arizona, in fact, leads the nation for proposed voter suppression with 19 restrictive bills that they are looking at. This would eliminate no excuse vote by mail. You know, we have that in our state where you don't need an excuse to vote by mail. They restrict who can assist voters in collecting and delivering mail ballots. Other bills that are adding voter identification requirements that are requiring mail ballots to be notarized or returned in person, or rejecting mail ballots postmarked later than the Thursday before the election, even if it's received by election day, and requiring stricter ID, showing proof of citizenship, and prohibiting automatic voter registration.
Yeah, amazing the number of things, and I'm glad you mentioned neighboring states, because one that truly amazed me that I just heard this week that is being proposed in Texas is to only allow a certain number of polling places in each county regardless of population. So you might have a county with a very small population and it has the same number of polling places as a place like Harris County with millions of registered voters. And we saw this already. We saw the results of this, again, with enormous lines for people waiting to vote. So this, unfortunately, is a modern issue. Rebecca, I only have a couple of minutes left here, so I want to end on a positive note. I am sure it is very gratifying to know that even though we still have efforts at voter suppression, future generations of young people will see this marker at Pioneer Women's Park. What other tools do you think that we need to have more engaged citizens who always vote and are involved in other civic engagement to hopefully prevent our society from wasting time on issues like this, where there are attempts to suppress the vote rather than to encourage it?
I will tell you one thing I've learned in the last 2 years. I've always voted in every election since I was 21, that's how old I am. But you know, when we formed this alliance, we created a motto, if every woman voted. And because of groups like the WIA, and now today, of course, the Progress Club, League of Women Voters, PEOs, throughout them and so on, carry on with community service. But these women understand the power of the vote. And I think what I learned is word of mouth, talking to other women, telling them to share with their families and so on. Even, of course, social media like Facebook and so on, where you have a dialogue. Don't ever stop the dialogue. Don't ever assume that everybody's going to vote or understand who they're voting for. Keep up the dialogue. It was hard last year because it was a very contentious election, but the dialogue made a difference on understanding what was happening and doing something about saving our democracy.
I am so glad you said that, because that is what it's all about. We certainly saw that an increase in voter turnout due to lots of people talking about the election, lots of people taking action to register people to vote and then to get them out there to the polls. Rebecca Courtney with the Progress Club of Las Cruces and Eileen VanWie, co-president of the League of Women Voters of Southern New Mexico. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fred.
We are part of GFWC, which is General Federation of Women's Clubs, which is an international organization of about 100,000 women. Our members have a lot of different backgrounds, they're different age groups, they have different interests, and so we provide a wide variety or diversity of opportunities for women to volunteer.
The Progress Club is celebrating a centennial from 1915 to 2015, which is remarkable in itself. But we're not the first women's club, and we wanted to pay homage in finding out about our history, about the women's clubs that had come before us. And the one that's most notable is the Women's Improvement Association, a group of wonderful women here in Las Cruces that formed a club in 1894 with the intention of providing civic services. In fact, they built the first park in Las Cruces with their own funds, and that park is still being used today, Pioneer Women's Park.
We collaborate with a lot of different organizations in town, the university being one, the public schools, where we volunteer our time on Dr. Seuss Day. We have members who work within the schools listening to children read. We also collaborate with the art community, and one of the projects we've been very proud of course, is the 5,000 Flower project that we have on view at City Hall, and that is a commemoration of 9/11.
And they also bought a hearse, the first hearse. Prior to that, people were being taken to their gravesite in the backs of wagons and who knows what, and they bought a beautiful hearse because they wanted to be able to take their friends and other people in our community to their gravesite with dignity. But anyway, that's the same hearse, of course, that's very famous now because it took Pat Garrett to his grave in 1908, and it's at the Sheriff's Department over at the county building.
When the organization was started, of course, women didn't even have the right to vote. Now women live very different lives and are very busy working and raising their families, and it's a challenge for any volunteer organization. What we try to do with the Progress Club is provide opportunities that interest women of all ages, so that the types of work that we're involved in is important to an array of women, regardless. And that seems to be very helpful. We have women in their 20s in our organization, on up to 93.
In the Depression era, they rented property in Las Cruces and raised food so that children could eat. And they built the first library with their own funds. That building still stands, the WIA building. When Alice Brannigan, one of their founding members, passed in 1932, her will gave the city of Las Cruces the money to build the very first city library named after her husband, Thomas Brannigan Memorial Library. The Women's Improvement Association doesn't exist anymore, but their legacy has been passed on to Progress Club. It was passed on to the Las Cruces Junior Women's Club. That club, unbelievably hard-working young women who were in their 20s and 30s, actually established the first domestic violence shelter in Las Cruces, which has now become La Casa.
It's been well recognized that women or people who volunteer live longer. So it provides better mental health, better physical health, and that's something regardless of generations that people are looking for.
So Progress Club is the only women's club still in existence, but we're thriving because there's a purpose for what we do. And even though our emphasis maybe is more on education and charity and not building buildings like the previous women did, we still serve a wonderful function in our city. It's just volunteering to keep your city strong and safe.
And since that video was produced, the hearse that carried Pat Garrett to his final resting place was moved. It is now at the Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum in Las Cruces. Well, that is our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's morning edition from 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now noon to 2, and All Things Considered 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.